Yeah, the pact is almost as bad as its name, AUKUS. I mean, they couldn't have come up with a worse sounding name for this ridiculous pact. Uh, the Biden administration, Biden made actually a pretty good speech yesterday at the United Nations. Unfortunately, what he's calling for and his vision are the opposite of the way he's been acting as president. He's done a lot of good things in the United States, or at least proposed a lot of good things when it comes to U.S. domestic policy, but his foreign policy is a disaster. Fareed Zakaria, uh, who I don't often agree with, uh, he kind of represents the liberal wing of the Council on Foreign Relations. He had an op-ed last week and the statement on his show in which he said that uh, Biden's foreign policy has been a continuation and a legitimization of Trump's foreign policy. He said it's shocking to look at Biden has doubled down on almost everything that Trump had done and that Biden had condemned. And now you look at this, maybe it's not that surprising because you look at who Biden's advisors are. Blinken, Sullivan, Kurt Campbell, Victoria Nuland when it comes to Ukraine, April Haines. These are the people who gave us the Asia pivot. These are the people who want to get out of Afghanistan, as Biden has done, not so that we can have peace, but so that we can focus more on the real enemy, and that's China. So these were the ones who drafted Hillary Clinton's 2011 uh, article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century, where she talks about getting out of the wars in the Middle East and focusing on China. And so, in that context, Biden, from the very beginning, has been creating a very hostile approach toward China and saying that this is our real adversary. Sometimes he says just a competitor. But if you look at the fact that we're throwing so much money into this, the defense budget, Biden asked for $715 billion. Congress gave him 25 billion on top of that, 740 billion. You look at the statements about the likelihood or possibility of war against China, the Americans are preparing for this. And the worst hotspot, of course, the most dangerous one is not Ukraine. Ukraine is probably number two. The most dangerous hotspot right now is Taiwan. So the U.S. has and its allies have been mobilizing against China. In fact, when Biden went to Europe in June, the idea was we were going to mend fences with our European allies so that we could get them all on board to focus on China, the real challenge, the real enemy, the real adversary. Biden has really screwed up in a lot of ways trying to do that. So so they decide now that we need to tighten relations with Australia. France had this submarine deal, $66 billion to sell a dozen non-nuclear conventional diesel powered submarines to Australia. Initially, the French wanted to sell the Australians nuclear powered submarines. The French and the Chinese nuclear power, so there are 6 countries that have nuclear powered submarines. The original 5 members of the NPT, original 5 nuclear powers, and India all have nuclear powered submarines. The model used by France and China uses low enriched uranium, about 6% enriched uranium. The model used by the United States and Britain, because the Americans gave the Brits that technology back in the 50s, uses 93.5% enriched uranium. So this is going to operate on several different levels, the significance of what occurred. First of all, the Australians pull out of the deal with France. The French could have upgraded that to a nuclear subs if the Australians wanted, but the Australians were the ones who said they didn't want it initially because it was more expensive and harder to maintain. The Australians don't have nuclear capabilities, so they opted for the diesel ones. But then they just pull out of the deal. That has devastating consequences for the French. The French whole Indo-Pacific strategy was based upon this deal with Australia and working together very closely. So it undermines France's Indo-Pacific strategy, number one. Number two, it costs them a huge sum of money that they were going to make on this deal. And three, they feel that they were stabbed in the back. The Europeans were already unhappy with the way Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. Now they've got something on top of that, and something very, very serious. The French foreign minister said that this was a stab in the back by the United States, that this was a betrayal. He talks about American duplicity and lies. They say this is a humiliation and embarrassment, and it was. And there they are looking very, very weak, embarrassed, cut out, uninformed. In fact, there were all these meetings going on, and the French didn't even know that this was happening, that this was all secret up to the last minute before the French even find out that this is happening. So this is going to have repercussions on several levels. Immediately, there was supposed to be that same night a celebration in the French embassy in Washington, D.C., of the 240th anniversary of France defeating Britain on behalf of the United States in the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. France was America's original ally, and it was going to be a big celebration. They canceled that. Then they recalled their ambassador from Canberra, from Australia, as well as from Washington. This is a big diplomatic blowout. And then you look at it from the standpoint of Macron. Macron is in a very, very tight election race against these extreme right wingers, Le Pen, in France. In 7 months, there's going to be a presidential election. This weakens him, embarrasses him. What is the United States thinking? They want another right-wing zealot to take power in France? I'm not a fan of Macron, certainly, but compared to Le Pen, Macron is head and shoulders better for the United States interest. But Biden's vision on this was so limited. And then the other significance of this, so the idea that from the US standpoint is we can work with Britain. The British say they're back again, global Britain. What does global Britain mean to Johnson? They announced they were increasing their nuclear arsenal from 180,000 nuclear weapons to 180 nuclear weapons to 260 nuclear weapons. A 40% increase in Britain's nuclear weapons is the immediate plan. These Trident submarines, Trident missiles. They also want to get involved more around Taiwan. The biggest danger globally now is something's going to blow up around Taiwan. The Chinese have been increasing their patrols and their fortifications in the Strait of Taiwan. The Americans have been doing a lot of provocative actions there. The Taiwanese are sounding more and more like they want independence. China is willing to tolerate the Taiwanese independence as long as nobody talks about abrogating the one China policy. But the Biden administration, in their contacts, higher level contacts, inviting people to the inauguration from Taiwan, this is what has riled up the Chinese so seriously. And that's why so many people are talking about the possibility of nuclear war in that region. The Pentagon has run 18 war games over a fight in the Strait of Taiwan. The Chinese have won all 18 in Pentagon war games. Taiwan is 100 miles from China. Taiwan is 5,000 miles from Honolulu. What is the United States going to do? We don't have the capability. The Chinese have been building up their nuclear as well as their not conventional capabilities in that area. And so this is a tinderbox that's ready to explode. The idea behind the sub deal with Australia, even though it's going to take a long time to bring those online, is that eventually Australia can get involved with the United States in defending Taiwan when the fighting starts. You've also got Japan making statements about Taiwan, that the self-defense forces can get involved there also. So what we're seeing is this polarization, choosing sides, and what Admiral Richard Charles Richard, the head of the U.S. Strategic Command, has said recently is that within the next 5 years, there's a good chance of nuclear war in that region. We had just 2 days ago the Secretary of the Air Force warning about the same thing. We've got other statements from Strategic Command, statements, tweets warning about the likelihood of war in that region. It's very, very dangerous. The other thing that stinks about this deal is that this is opening the door for nuclear proliferation. Nobody's done anything like this. There's a loophole in the Non-Proliferation Treaty saying that submarines and other things are legitimate as long as they're not for the purposes of nuclear weapons. And there's a difference between nuclear submarines that can carry nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons. A nuclear powered submarine is much more effective against China because it's got, in terms of stealth, in terms of endurance, in terms of range, it's much more effective for aggressive offensive fighting against China. And so, but that's what the Australians are thinking in terms of now. And it's partly China's stupid fault. The Chinese are so heavy handed and inflexible, and they're doing this in the South China Sea. Instead of including Vietnam and the others and legitimizing their claims, there's enough wealth to be shared by everybody. China's hardline policy, their what is it, 9-dash line, saying that this is all theirs, has created such hostility that the Vietnamese recently signed a new enhanced security agreement with Japan, because they're so upset about what China's doing there. The same thing with China's treatment of Australia. Australia cut Huawei out of their 5G networks. Australia said they wanted an investigation of the origins of the coronavirus in the Chinese labs. So the Chinese have come down hard, boycotting various essential things in terms of trade with Australia. But Australia says they need this to keep their trade lanes open. The trade lanes? By far, Australia's biggest trading partner is China. They need nuclear powered submarines to keep their trade lanes with China open against China? It makes no sense. We're dealing with morons here. But the other thing is that, so now we've established this precedent that we can sell highly enriched uranium powered submarines to countries like Australia. Then why can't China sell them to Iran or Pakistan? Why can't, Russia sell them, whoever, to North Korea? We're opening the door to the likelihood of nuclear proliferation here. And that highly enriched uranium that has to be monitored, that Australia doesn't even have the capability of developing or dealing with themselves at this point, can very, very easily lead to some of that being used for nuclear weapons. And so, in a world that's already so dangerous, the United States, in order to gain some geopolitical advantage against China, has just made it that much more dangerous. So, all those good words that Biden spoke at the United Nations yesterday are simply bullshit. It's just hypocrisy. The US is saying one thing and going the other direction. And that's exactly what the Chinese called Blinken and Sullivan out on in their meeting in Anchorage in March. Blinken goes first and he gives a couple-minute harangue against China for Xinjiang and the treatment of the Uyghurs, which is true, Hong Kong and various other things. And then the Chinese foreign ministry spokesman gets up for 16 minutes, says, "Who the fuck are you to try to talk to us like that? You talk about rules-based international order. You're the main ones who have been destroying that. Look at the countries you're invading. Look at the countries you're bombing. Look at your 800 bases around the world. Look at what the United States has been doing for the last 30 years." And, and that's said, you can't talk to us from that like that. And that's the reality. So, the world is very, very dangerous right now. And we've got to make sure that, we go in an opposite direction. This building up of armed alliances and military spending and military solutions to non-military problems is the exact wrong way to approach this.